Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to present the top 5 returners in tennis history, and this list was tough to make because when we're talking about the return there are many variables. Are we talking about the forehand return to serve, maybe the backhand return to serve? Are we talking about returning a first serve or a second serve? Are we talking about what surface the return is taking place at? And also we can discuss the intention of the returner. Some returners are more aggressive than others. So the return of serve is a very complex stroke. But in today's video, I'm gonna judge the return of serve in isolation. And the top 5 list that I put together hits all the checkpoints: the first serve return, the second serve return, the forehand return, and the backhand return. But like I said, we're looking at it more from a shot making standpoint rather than the whole return game in total. That's gonna be a separate ranking that I'm gonna present at the end of the video, so make sure you stay tuned in all the way to the end. And generally, great baseliners also happen to be great returners. So the list of great returners that have been playing tennis in the modern era is huge, and some names deserve to be mentioned despite the fact that I didn't quite make it onto my top 5. So I'm going to read you some of these names because I gotta put respect on these names. Andy Murray, David Nalbandian, James Blake, Nikolai Davydenko, Leighton Hewitt, Michael Chang, Guillermo Coria, Bjorn Borg, Marcelo Rios, Tomas Muster, Juan Carlos Ferrero, and Yevgeny Kafelnikov. And there's a lot more players that I didn't mention who happen to be great returners. But let's get started with the top 5. And coming in at number 5, and this is going to be a surprise to many of you watching, I'm going to put Roger Federer. And Roger Federer is not regarded as one of the greatest returners in tennis history, but the reason why I'm putting Roger Federer in my top 5, because I'm judging the return in isolation. You have to understand that when we're talking about players' styles, this is very important to recognize. For example, Pete Sampras wasn't a great returner, but he was a great returner for one return game in the set. So once he got that break of serve, Pete Sampras being one of the greatest servers in the history of tennis, he didn't care so much about the other return games. All he needed was one break. And Roger Federer, being possibly the most offensive player in the history of tennis with possibly the greatest hold game on his serve, didn't need to return perfectly in every return game. So similar to Sampras, Federer would often play some lackluster return games here and there, and that's why he doesn't show up in the top of the return statistics very often. But from a ball striking aspect, Roger Federer had one of the greatest returns in the history of tennis. And if you remember in the early 2000s when Federer was playing Andy Roddick, who had one of the fastest serves in the history of tennis, Federer's ability to redirect pace with his backhand return by basically blocking the ball back and hitting it almost as fast as the incoming serve was truly spectacular. Federer's ability to chip the ball back very low with a tremendous amount of feel also put Federer in a neutral position in a rally very frequently. But what's the most impressive about Federer to me was his forehand return. And in my opinion, Roger Federer has the greatest forehand in the history of tennis, and his forehand return was one of the greatest in the history of tennis as well. Just take a look at a Roger Federer return compilation when Roger Federer got the chance to run around his backhand on the return and blast one of these forehand winners. I've never seen somebody do it as well as Roger did it. And coming in at number 4 is Jimmy Connors with one of the greatest returns in the history of tennis, but it was more of an old school return. Connors didn't take full swings like all the other players that I'm going to mention in my top 5. If you take a look at the 1991 US Open tournament where Jimmy Connors, as a 39-year-old, made the semifinals, he will often use what I call the bunt and charge. So it's not a chip and then come to the net, it's a bunt return that's like a quarter swing, and Jimmy Connors would place the return deep into the court in different locations, and he would come to the net and give himself a good chance to finish the point off with a volley. He had an amazing ability to redirect pace from the baseline, but not only from there, also on the return of serve. He would use the pace of the opponent, and he had exceptional timing. And back in the day, it was incredibly difficult to hold serve against Connors. And not only for the reason that he had incredible timing and took the ball extremely early, Connors was also one of the biggest fighters in the history of tennis. I compare him to the Rafael Nadal of his era because Connors would try so hard to get the return back in play. Even when it looked like Connors would get aced, he would somehow get his racket on the ball, and very similar to another player that I'm going to mention in my top 5, he would loop the ball back into the court, neutralize the ball, and give himself the chance to win the point from the baseline. Both the forehand and the backhand return of Connors was very old-fashioned. There wasn't a lot of spin on the ball. It was a very flat stroke, which meant that his return was incredibly fast and aggressive despite the fact that it wasn't a full swing. Generally, for other players, this could mean that there would be more mistakes, but not for Connors because he's one of the greatest players in the history of tennis. Despite the fact that his strokes were extremely flat, Connors was unbelievably consistent from the baseline, but also on the return of serve. And coming in at number 3 is my favorite player of all time, and that's Rafael Nadal. Rafael Nadal has one of the greatest returns in the history of tennis. Now, Nadal's return often gets stigmatized because Nadal has a tendency to stand very far in the back fence, but that's not always the case. All I want you to do is take a look at Nadal's break of serve against the greatest server of all time, Ivo Karlovic, when Nadal was hitting one return winner after another off of Ivo Karlovic's first serve, standing fairly close to the baseline. So Nadal absolutely has the ability to return more like Connors and take the ball early and stand further in the court and redirect the pace. His timing on the return of serve is incredible, but one thing that Nadal does better than any other returners is finding angles. If you take a look on YouTube at a compilation of Nadal returns, you will see that Nadal is able to create incredible angles from far away from the court and hit return winners that almost look like shanks. But I can guarantee you that those were not shanks because he does this over and over again. Nadal would often neutralize his return by looping it back in the court, and there was not much that players could do with that type of ball. Jimmy Connors would do something that's very similar on first serve returns that were very tough to get. This seems a lot easier to do than it is in reality, and it takes a lot of control to be able to get the ball deep and high to the court and have the ability to neutralize the incoming serve. Nadal had a phenomenal backhand return, but his forehand return was better. Nadal, having one of the greatest forehands of all time, was able to put a tremendous amount of topspin on his return. So that finish that everybody knows about, the buggy whip finish, was also something that Nadal did on his return of serve. He would often hit forehand returns for winners, but even if not, the fact that his return was so heavy made it an absolute nightmare for the opponent, and they would be starting the rally after the serve on the defensive. And for that reason, Rafael Nadal has one of the greatest returns in the history of tennis, and that's why I place him at number 3 all time. And coming in at number 2 is Novak Djokovic. And one thing that Novak does better than anybody else in history is improvisation. And often the return of serve is all about improvisation because the serve happens to be the fastest stroke in tennis. Novak, being flexible and having incredible reflexes, he's able to bend his body in crazy ways and make clean contact as a result of it. Most other players would get jammed on specific type of serves, but not Novak. Because of his flexibility, because of his quickness and his incredible reflexes, he's able to get his body in a position that's such where he is not going to lose control of the ball and is able to hit a quality return. But it's not all about improvisations. Novak Djokovic, when he wants to, can also unleash incredible power on the return. Now, one thing that he does different from Jimmy Connors, which is more similar to Federer, is that Novak Djokovic takes full cuts on the return. Yes, he might abbreviate the amount of turn that he makes and his backswing to a degree, but he always manages to finish his returns, whether we talk about the forehand return or the backhand return. For that reason, when he finishes his return, he gets the unbelievable combination of control and power because he is using that pace of the incoming serve. And I'm sure you've seen blasting winners from Djokovic on the return of serve where he hits down the line or cross court, but that's actually not Novak's best return in my opinion. Novak's best return is the one that he hits through the middle of the court, where he rips the ball as hard as he can. He has ultimate control over that shot, and now often the opponents are handcuffed and they start the point on the defensive. And coming in at number 1, the greatest returner in the history of tennis, the king of all returners, is Andre Agassi. And you're probably thinking, Nick, why would you put Andre ahead of Djokovic? Isn't Djokovic considered the greatest returner of all time? And I'm going to tell you why I made the choice to put Andre ahead of Djokovic. And it's for the simple fact that Andre had to face tougher conditions, and despite these tough conditions, he was able to return spectacularly. So what do I mean by different conditions? Well, first of all, Andre played in an era where we had the greatest servers in the history of tennis. Pete Sampras, Boris Becker, Goran Ivanisevic, Michael Stich, Richard Krajicek, Greg Rusetsky, and the list goes on and on. These were some of the greatest servers in the history of tennis, and Andre was playing against them on fast surfaces. This was in an era before tennis was slowed down. You can take a look at a match on YouTube where Agassi played Becker on carpet in Davis Cup. Do you know how fast carpet is? This surface doesn't exist anymore. And Andre was able to return spectacularly well against one of the greatest servers of all time, Boris Becker, indoors on carpet. And it's not only carpet, the hard courts were faster, the grass courts were faster, and most importantly, the balls were a lot faster as well. So when you hear people say players nowadays return much better, I'm going to tell you this. Players nowadays return really well. I'm not saying that they don't return as well as the players from the 90s. But do you think that players in the 90s could stand all the way towards the back fence like Nadal does, or Medvedev, or even Djokovic sometimes? If you stood back there and you were playing Sampras or Becker, or Stich for that matter, on a fast surface like carpet or a fast hard court or fast grass, you would have absolutely no chance to break serve, because what would happen would be the following. Players would return from back there, and by the time they hit their return, someone like Sampras would already be at the net, and they would have absolutely no time to retrieve, and they would have very little chances to win the point. Nowadays, nobody serves and volleys. And yes, of course, players do it occasionally, but not to the extent that they were doing it in the 90s. And players stand all the way towards the back fence. They hit the return, and they have plenty of time to get into a neutral baseline position where they can start the rally. This was impossible back in the day. So what did Agassi do? Well, Agassi stood right on the baseline or a little bit behind the baseline, and he took full cuts on fast surfaces with fast balls against some of the greatest servers in the history of tennis, and he did it with a lot of success. Take a look at a compilation reel on YouTube, and you'll see Agassi hitting blistering return winners. Similar to Djokovic, Agassi would reduce the amount of turn that he made. He would reduce his take back, but he would take a full cut on the return and redirect the ball sometimes with more pace than the actual serve that he was receiving. And he would do the same thing on his backhand. He would minimize the take back. He wouldn't go all the way back, but he would take a full cut on his backhand return and hit one blistering return winner after another. Look, as far as the quality of the return, Djokovic and Agassi are equals. And the only reason why I'm putting Agassi slightly ahead of Djokovic is the context of the era he was playing in. And now I'm going to list the players who had the greatest return game. And you're probably thinking, Nick, what's the difference between the return game and the return in isolation? Well, think of it this way. If you were serving against a specific player, how difficult would it be to hold serve? So I'm going to list the two players that by far were the most difficult ones when it came to holding serve against them. And these two players are Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic. On clay, there is no player in the history of tennis who had a better return game than Rafael Nadal. Just think about how difficult it must be to hold serve against Nadal on clay. Not only is he going to punish you with his return, but he's also going to manage to get that return back in play with some good quality, and now you are in a neutral position and you're going to have to win a baseline rally on clay against the greatest clay court player in tennis history. Just think about how difficult it is to hold serve against Djokovic, and what's most fascinating about Djokovic is when he loses serve, he returns his best. So just imagine that you're playing against Djokovic and you manage somehow to break him and you're all happy, and now you have to hold serve And this guy starts ripping balls right down the middle almost as fast as you serve. Novak Djokovic is the greatest re-breaker in the history of tennis. So in my opinion, the greatest two players regarding their return games are Djokovic and Nadal. Djokovic on all surfaces except clay, where Rafa is king.